Hey everybody, and welcome back to Plugged Into Public Health. Pregnancy, childbirth, parental leave, discrimination law, workplace protections. These are topics that most people assume are straightforward until they actually have to navigate them. And as today's conversation makes clear, the legal framework surrounding pregnancy and parenthood in the U.S. is often far more complicated and in some cases more limited than many people realize. In this episode, I sit down with Professor Katharine Baker from the University of Iowa College of Law to unpack how U.S. law approaches pregnancy, childbirth, parental leave, and gender equality. We talk about the history behind the Family and Medical Leave Act, why pregnancy law developed differently than many other areas of discrimination law, and how the U.S. compares to other countries when it comes to supporting parents and families. This conversation really highlights the tension between equality in theory and equality in practice, and how difficult it can be to design policies that account for the realities of pregnancy, caregiving, work, and family life. Even when the legal history gets complicated, the real-world implications are incredibly important. I'm Lauren Lavin, and if it's your first time with us, welcome. We're a student-run podcast that talks about major issues in public health and how they are relevant to anyone both in and outside the field of public health. So let's get plugged into public health. Plugged Into Public Health is produced and edited by the students at the University of Iowa College of Public Health, and the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the student hosts, guests, and contributors. They do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of the University of Iowa or the College of Public Health. Thank you so much, Professor Baker, for being on the podcast with me today. To start out, could you introduce yourself, who you are, what you do here at the University of Iowa?
I am a professor of law at the College of Law. I teach a variety of classes, almost all of which have sort of women at the center. Not completely true, but my real scholarly interests actually always put women at the center of what I'm writing about. And I got particularly interested in this topic a few years ago as I was thinking about how ill-equipped I thought United States' discrimination law was to grapple with the dilemmas of pregnancy and caretaking.
Yeah. And as a little educational background for our listeners, you have a law degree and are currently a professor, but oftentimes you also, professors at the law school, do research as well. Okay.
So I have written extensively about parenthood. In the last 10 years or so, I've written about gestation as distinct from parenthood and the law's treatment of gestation and pregnancy.
Yeah.
And most recently, I wrote a comparative piece that was looking at the history of the way the United States legal system has treated pregnancy on the one hand versus women in sports on the other hand. And I know that's a sort of curious combination of things. But we've taken very different approaches to those two subjects. And there's been sort of tension within those subjects for all of the 20th century. Wait a minute, should we treat women differently because they're pregnant, or should we treat them just the same as men? And comparably in sports, should we have different women's sports, or should we just treat them the same as men? And we've actually come to very different conclusions in those two areas. And that's what piqued my interest.
Yeah. How did you notice the differences in those two areas? Are you involved in the sports side of things too,
I was an athlete in high school and college and at the very beginning of Title IX. So I've always been interested in that. I will say I'm new to the University of Iowa. I just got here this year, and I went to an Iowa women's basketball game, and I took a picture and I texted it to friends from college to say, we never would have thought there would be this many people watching a women's basketball game. So I'm a big Title IX fan. Yeah.
It's interesting. I think I just saw something on social media the other day that's, what if we referred to men's sports the same way we refer to women's? Women's, it's the WNBA. What if it was the MNBA?
Right.
That, we don't do that.
And that annoyed me since high school when I had to stand up in assembly and say, the girls are playing basketball, as opposed to saying there's a basketball game.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I had not even, that's so basic in our language.
Yep.
Interesting. Okay, you also said this is your first year at Iowa. What were you doing prior to this?
I was a law professor at Chicago Kent College of Law in Chicago for many years. raised a family there, and I wasn't in a position to move, and then I became an empty nester, and I took advantage of that.
What drew you to Iowa?
It was a little random because they asked me to visit, and then I visited, and I was charmed, and I
just pulled you in.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh my gosh.
And much to my surprise, it's actually quite a beautiful drive. So I commute a fair amount, and it's quite a beautiful drive for a chunk of it.
Yeah. When the closer you get to Chicago, the worse the traffic gets, though.
And the worse the environment gets also.
And the tolls. The tolls are shockingly expensive.
I'm used. You're used to I'm used to tolls. Tolls don't bother me.
Yeah.
Like really boring industrial landscape, that bothers me.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. And I found out about you because you did a CPH Spotlight series here, and you were talking about pregnancy and childbirth and parental leave. So can we start at that high level, and how does U.S. law currently approach pregnancy, childbirth, parental leave? I know those are big buckets, so feel free to take them on as you choose.
So I think the sort of most important distinction for people to be able to make is the difference between the U.S. treats pregnancy on the one hand and childbirth and parental leave on the other. Pregnancy is treated as a matter of discrimination law and is mostly treated the way that disability discrimination is treated, in that the U.S. has pretty strong, good laws saying an employer isn't allowed to fire you just because you're pregnant, and the employer has to make reasonable accommodations to allow you to keep working if you need some adjustments due to some of the limitations of pregnancy. But that all has nothing to do with the way we treat childbirth and parental leave. The U.S., pretty much alone in the world, conflates childbirth and parental leave so that, for the most part, any rights you have, for instance, to time off in order to actually birth a child, is treated the same way as time off you need to go to a child's school play when the kid is 10 years old. And in fact, the same way as the law treats you if you have an emergency appendicitis. All of that is just considered medical leave.
And I think it's safe to say that they're pretty different things. So considering them the same under law doesn't maybe necessarily make sense.
I think it doesn't make sense because I think that what it ignores, ultimately to women's detriment, is that childbirth, like gestation itself, but childbirth is a big deal. It is exhausting.
Yeah, physically.
It is dangerous in its own way. And our approach glosses over the unique nature of childbirth, or maybe I will say the very distinct nature of childbirth, in that it is very different to be a parent who gives birth and a parent who doesn't give birth in terms of your medical condition. And U.S. law basically does not recognize that anywhere.
So in the U.S., we do not have any paid protection for paternity or maternity leave.
Right. We have no guaranteed paid protection. One of the reasons I think that we actually conflate leave and childbirth has to do with the history of how we approached pregnancy. I mentioned that pregnancy is treated as a form of discrimination, and technically it's called sex discrimination, but it really manifests itself more as a kind of disability discrimination, because where your protection comes in is if you can argue that, look, I'm being treated differently when the employer could just be treating me as a disabled person and giving me some sort of reasonable accommodation, then it would be, and that would be better. When mostly feminists, led by Ruth Bader Ginsburg in the 1970s, tried to establish that pregnancy was sex discrimination, for the most part, they failed. They failed in the courts. And the way I think it's easiest to understand why they failed is the women's rights movement in this country, the late 20th century women's rights movement, followed on the heels of the civil rights movement. And at the sort of heart of the legal strategy in the civil rights movement was this notion that we should treat all races alike, we should have a colorblind constitution. There's making distinctions between blacks and white people in the era of Jim Crow is per se a problem. And so a lot of the original approach to sex discrimination was based on something similar, like you can't treat women differently than men. And that strategy worked great for some things, but it was deeply perplexing to the court when it came to pregnancy because you couldn't find a man who was pregnant. So if you said men and women have to be treated the same, but one of them was gestating a fetus and one wasn't, what does that mean to treat them the same? And the Supreme Court basically said that discrimination or treating pregnant people differently is not sex discrimination. I won't get into the sort of relationship between constitutional law and statutory law. Congress tried to overturn that sort of, but basically, we've never fully grappled with this idea that pregnancy is something that affects women and women alone, with the exception now of a very few trans men. So the problem for U.S. law is really, what is this pregnancy thing? And the history basically went like this. Some states and policies began to experiment with the idea of paid leave, and that made some feminists nervous because they were like, wait a minute, you're treating mothers better than fathers if you give them some kind of paid leave. Even if the paid leave had everything to do with childbirth, not parental leave. And the Supreme Court actually decided that it's actually not sex discrimination to treat pregnancy different than parental leave. Legally, that's not a problem. But again, that made feminists nervous, and they mobilized. It was a big logistical political project, but they mobilized to pass nationwide gender-neutral protection around parental leave. And that ended up in the Family and Medical Leave Act. So the Family and Medical Leave Act is the protection that we now give to all parents, whether they're the gestating parent or a non-gestating parent. And the politics of that, it took 12 years. It took a really long time.
Yeah, what time period are we in right
So
here?
FMLA was passed, Bill Clinton signed it. So I want to say it was,
90s?
right, it was sort of late-ish 80s to the 90s.
Okay.
Maybe not a full 12 years, 10 years probably somewhere in there. And the thinking was it will perpetuate stereotypes against women if we treat pregnancy differently. And that was the concern, that we'd be perpetuating these stereotypes about pregnant women and mothers not being able to work in the workplace.
And whose concern was this?
Like a number of people, but particularly people who wanted to champion women's cause,
Okay,
right?
yeah.
There were feminists who were concerned about that. There were other feminists that were like, whoa, this is a really hard thing that women have to go through, and we should actually think about treating it differently. I'll just throw in right here, and we can talk more about this later. We are unique in the world in insisting that pregnancy is just like everything else. Virtually every other country says pregnancy is its own distinct thing, and we can give protection for it, even if that disproportionately helps in some ways those who are actually pregnant.
Yeah.
So the compromise with the FMLA, because people were insisting that it be gender neutral, was that it can't be paid. So what we have produced is a guaranteed 12 weeks of unpaid leave per year for people who work for employers that are covered by the FMLA. But again, as I say, what that means is that we just treat this whole childbirth thing as just another medical need one has. And At least for purposes of federal legislation. So that's the sort of big picture of how we got here.
So you said that the court decided that pregnancy was not sex discrimination. So what did it fall under then?
Nothing for a while.
Okay.
Nothing.
So
it fell under nothing for a while, and then the original policies that were brought that were the basis of the suits were health insurance policies that didn't cover pregnancy. Yeah. They excluded pregnancy, and the court said that's okay. And then Congress got into the act and said, wait, no, that's not okay. You have to treat pregnancy like other disabilities. And then one state said, okay, actually, we want a health insurance policy that treats pregnancy a little bit better, that actually gives women a kind of protection that not everyone else gets if they actually get pregnant. That's what got challenged. And the Supreme Court said that's okay to treat women better than men in that instance because women actually go through childbirth, men don't.
Yeah. And then within FMLA, which I'm sure a lot of people have heard about, I don't think I was aware that men were entitled to 12 weeks. Is it after their spouse has a baby, or do they just say we have a medical need in the family?
They are entitled to their 12 weeks. They can take it when their spouse is taking parental leave also. They can take it afterwards.
Interesting. I don't feel like that many people avail themselves of that. Maybe it's a monetary component since it is unpaid.
So the average amount of time that gestator takes under FMLA leave is 54 days, and the average amount of time I think that a man takes is 18 days. So it's... Right. It's very different.
And 54 days is not the full 12 weeks.
No, not at all. No, medically, it's not. Yes.
Yeah. Right. Interesting. And is that the only protection offered in FMLA related to?
Yes.
Okay. It's just that your job will be there when you get back. Okay. What do you see as the most significant gaps in this current legal framework?
So I think the lack of paid leave is huge. And there are lots of people who don't agree with me, but with whom I'm mostly politically aligned. But I think that the premium that we put on gender neutrality actually undermines equality goals because it basically forces women to absorb all of the physical and financial costs of gestation and childbirth on their own, right? Those are costs that people who do not gestate never experience. And I think that's a problem. I think it would be much easier for pregnancy to be incorporated into women's regular sort of workflow, work trajectory if it were paid. Often what happens is that someone who doesn't have any paid leave available, some employers provide paid leave that they're not required to pay. But for women who don't have paid leave available, they are more likely to fall off of the job picture completely because it's like too hard to juggle everything and they're not getting paid for the leave. Whereas if they're getting paid and they oftentimes, like, in order to get paid you have to go back to work, but that serves as an incentive to keep women engaged and in the workforce.
Yeah. And as you're saying all this, I'm thinking if they offered paid leave to both men and women, wouldn't that kind of even the playing field in terms of
but it would be expensive. Yes, in the ideal world, which actually appears at times to be
that's going to be my next question.
And Scandinavia, we would have paid leave for both. I have no problem with what most of the rest of the world does, which is say, actually, we can have more paid leave for the people who actually gestate than the ones that don't. But much of the rest of the world does give paid leave to both parents.
Yeah, so then the question is, how does the U.S. compare to other industrialized countries when it comes to both the parental leave and like just other support systems legally?
The EU, for instance, requires 2 weeks of paid leave to the gestator at or around birth. A requirement like that might very well violate sex discrimination doctrine in this country, to just show you like how unaligned our legal systems are and how we think about this, right? I could see a court saying, you can't do that. You can't force employers to treat gestating parents differently than non-gestating parents. That's a form of sex discrimination. But the reason that the EU does that is to prevent bargaining, right? They don't want the employer to be able to say, hey, if you come back after just a week, I'll pay you extra that week. They want to just make that a right that's inviolable. But in addition to that, the vast majority of countries in the Western world provide some sort of paid leave after childbirth. And this can range from up to 8 months in Sweden. In Sweden, each parent gets 8 months at 77% of their paycheck. So it's not full pay, but it's significant. In France, I believe women get 16 weeks of full paid leave. Men get much less. So one of the ways in which, with the exception of some of the Scandinavian countries, which are particularly generous with regard to all sorts of social welfare benefits, a bunch of countries, almost all countries, provide something that's paid, and they provide more to the gestator than the non-gestator.
I have 2 follow-up questions. Is there no legal way in the law to differentiate, because it comes down to the sex discrimination component, that like fundamentally like the sexes in this case experience different things?
Yes. I think it's very different to go through childbirth than to watch someone else go through childbirth. I've done it. I still believe that. And yet that is something that U.S. law, for the most part, does not. It doesn't force people to recognize. It allows people to recognize. So some listeners may be confused. Wait a minute. I have a policy that actually pays. I have a parental leave policy that actually pays me. So what we have allowed in this country, we don't require, but we allow employers, if they want to provide paid leave to both gestators and non-gestators, and we allow employers to provide more paid leave to gestators if they can justify that greater amount of paid leave to accommodate the actual physical disability of childbirth. 4 weeks more for the gestator than non-gestator is probably fine. You can get plenty of medical opinions that will say at 4 weeks, she's barely recovered.
Yeah.
If it got a lot more than that, it can be. Basically, the justification has to be, to the extent you're treating parents differently, it has to be related to the physical nature, the physiological disability of childbirth itself. But you're also allowed to rely on some averages, right? You don't need, if you're one of those incredibly lucky women who 10 days later is, I'm ready to go. Your employer doesn't have to say, okay, then you don't have any more leave left. That would be administratively prohibitive.
Yeah. So each company has to determine and justify their
They
policy?
don't have to. They do what they do. And then if someone sues them saying this is not okay, they just defend it that way.
Oh,
so there's guidance from the Equal Employment Opportunity Corporation, which is the governmental entity that enforces sex discrimination law. And that guidance says you can treat gestators differently, but it has to be related to the childbirth itself.
Yeah. And then my second follow-up question, I'm sure lots of other people are thinking this, as you talk about EU countries in their pay for parental leave and maternity leave, who pays for it?
Taxpayers through taxes, through a state. All of medical care in most Western countries is financed primarily through governments, and that's tax dollars. So that's the answer. Now, as I'm sure most listeners to this podcast realize, that who exactly pays for our health care is incredibly confusing in this country, because there's a whole bunch of government subsidy that just comes in the form of tax credits. It's very hard to all parse out. But yes, it would be a burden. And it would be an increased tax burden in some way. And the question is that the kind of priority that we think our tax dollars should go towards?
In companies in the U.S. that do have some sort of paid leave, are they fronting all of the costs for that?
Yeah, for the most part.
Okay.
Yes. And so part of what that means, and this I think is one of the real tragedies, is the workers with most access to paid leave are the workers with the least need for it. Yeah. The companies that are most likely to give generous leave are well-financed. They are law firms and tech companies and big banks and things like that. And most of those people who are working there probably have some sort of safety net nest egg that with a little bit of planning, they could actually swing it without getting paid. And the people that are most vulnerable are the ones who work for smaller employers and don't have any of that. Now, I should say a number of state labor unions have prioritized this issue and gotten paid leave for their workers. And those workers are not necessarily making law firm wages. Yeah. But the workers who can least afford to go with unpaid leave end up being the ones that have to take it. And what I find particularly upsetting is that for single moms who don't have a partner who is particularly interested in caretaking or willing to help out, they're stuck. Because in the name of gender equality, we said we have to treat both parents the same, but she doesn't have another parent. And so there's no one to help with the caretaking, and she's got to do all of this on unpaid time. And I think those are the people who are most likely to drop out completely, move in with relatives or whatever, because they just can't swing everything.
Yeah. Are there any states that do paid leave?
Yes, there are some states. California, I think, requires some paid leave. Massachusetts may require some paid leave. I haven't done a recent survey of what those are, but yes, there are some states that do that.
Okay, we're nearing the end here. But from a policy standpoint, what changes do you think would be, or policy or legal, what changes do you feel would be meaningful but also realistically achievable in the near term?
So if you look at public opinion polling, and you have to take a bunch of that obviously with a grain of salt, but there seems to be a fair amount of bipartisan overall support for some sort of paid leave around childbirth and parenting. And I think that most people actually could swallow the idea that we could actually support the person who's giving birth, even if we don't also support the co-parent. I think there might very well actually be more popular support for paid maternity leave than paid both. Yeah. So that's a good sign. Like maybe people are willing to say, look, if I'm paying my tax dollars, I think this is a priority that the government should attend to. There's also, especially from the right and our vice president, an increasing concern around birth rate. And if we want people to have more babies, one way to try and encourage people to have more babies is actually treat the process of having babies a little bit better. So it's not outside the realm of possibility for me that we could actually get some kind of paid leave. What we've tended to do recently is just make the leave and the beneficial treatment all in the form of tax rebates. And for people who aren't paying taxes or are paying minimal taxes, that basically does nothing. Mm-hmm. It's yet again a kind of regressive way of dealing with a problem, because the people for whom it's the biggest issue aren't earning enough to take unpaid leave and aren't earning enough to have a tax break actually affect them all that significantly.
Yeah. So there's some hope.
Yes, there is some hope.
Who do you think would be most impactful in doing this work? Like, who moves this forward?
Who moves this forward? That's an excellent question. And I'm not sure, but I think it could be a coalition of, for instance, healthcare folks, I think, coming together with some people who were basically concerned about family policy, and some women's groups who, as I say, they've been split around this, but I'm not sure there couldn't be some sort of support generated for something like this.
Yeah. Okay, so my last question is, what's one thing you wish more people understood about how the law shapes pregnancy and early parenthood in the U.S.?
I think people would be surprised by how different and more difficult we make it in the U.S. than in the rest of the world. We're a pretty wealthy country. Most people understand the sort of benefits that come from that, but we think of ourselves as being relatively progressive when it comes to gender equality. We think of ourselves as being at the forefront of medical policy. And wow, do we treat this issue differently? And I think that if people got their head around the fact that we're really an outlier here, they might realize there was more room to make incremental reforms that they support.
Yeah, we can inch towards something a little better.
Yeah.
Yeah. Professor Baker, this was a super interesting conversation, and I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to chat with me.
Thank you for having me.
That's it for our episode this week. A big thank you to Professor Baker for joining us today. This conversation covered a lot of legal and policy ground, but I think one of the biggest takeaways is that many of the systems surrounding pregnancy and early parenthood in the U.S. were built through decades of legal compromise, political tension, and competing ideas about gender equality. And because of that, some of the policies we now take for granted still leave major gaps for families trying to navigate work, childbirth, and recovery. I also thought this episode was a really important reminder that public health is shaped not just by medicine or healthcare systems, but by policy and legal structures, workplace protections, and broader social choices we make about what kinds of support we believe people deserve. This episode was hosted and written by Lauren Lavin and edited and produced by Lauren Lavin. You can learn more about the University of Iowa College of Public Health on Facebook. Our podcast is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and SoundCloud. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to help support the podcast, please share it with your colleagues, friends, or anyone interested in public health. If you have a suggestion for our team, you can reach me at cph-gradambassador@uiowa.edu. This episode is brought to you by the University of Iowa College of Public Health. Until next week, stay healthy, stay curious, and take care.